To today's webinar. I am Julie Williams, the Director of Resource and Program Development here at First Book, and I will be your moderator today. We are thrilled to be here with you, and I want to start by thanking our sponsor, the National Education Association Foundation, for their support of this event. Today is truly a culmination in what's been an ongoing partnership between the NEA Foundation, Lee and Low Books, Cook Ross, and First Book to help educators teach their students about diversity and inclusion. And so we are excited today to discuss the blend of diversity, inclusion, and children's books with you because it is such an important topic. We are all working to learn and teach our children how to coexist and how to thrive in a world where there are differences, where we are not all the same. And so what does that mean for how we see ourselves? And what does that mean for how we see others? And so today we are going to discuss how to use children's books as a guide to help us answer some tough questions and open the floor for dialogue and open minds. And so these are some of the questions we are going to discuss today, along with many others with our panel of experts who have deep roots in diversity in children's literature, as well as the psychology of multicultural books. And they are here to share their insight, perspective, and actionable steps you can take to expand your use of diverse children's books with your students. And so before we get started, just a quick note about this webinar. Many of you submitted questions for the panelists during your registration period, and we've gone through all of those questions and have pulled those that have been the most popular or the most common themes. If you have questions during the course of today's talk, I want you to enter them into the chat box on your screen, and we will do our absolute best to get to them. Keep in mind that there are over 300 folks joining this webinar today, and so we won't be able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to highlight common themes and topics that come up. Also, if you have peers or colleagues who wanted to attend today's event but just were not available or able, this will be recorded. And so they will have opportunity in the future to hear all the great dialogue that we're going to have today with our panelists. And so with that said, I'm thrilled to introduce to you our panel for today. First, we have Mr. Howard Ross. He is a lifelong social justice advocate and the founding partner of Cook Ross Incorporated. He began his career in early childhood education, where he was a teacher and later a school administrator. In his nearly 30 years with Cook Ross, Howard has become one of the world's seminal thought leaders on identifying and addressing unconscious bias. He is the author of 2 books, including the Washington Post bestseller, Everyday Bias, Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Daily Lives. His organization has led diversity and cultural integration programs across the United States and in 40 other countries. His writings have been published by the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, and dozens of others. He currently serves on several boards for nonprofits, including the Human Rights Campaign, the National Women's Mentoring Network. Howard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Julie, it's my pleasure to be here.
Also, we have joining us is Ms. Hanna Ehrlich. She is the Director of Marketing and Publicity at Lee and Low Books, the largest multicultural children's book publisher in the United States. She has 9 years of experience marketing and publicizing diverse children's books at Lee and Low, and was one of the planners behind Lee and Low's landmark diversity baseline survey, the first survey to study staff diversity within the U.S. publishing industry. Hanna, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Julie.
And we have Dr. Krista Aronson. She is an associate professor of psychology at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, whose work focuses on understanding multicultural children's books and how they can be used to nurture social and emotional growth. Using the Diverse Children's Books Collection, or rather the Diverse Book Collection, a circulating collection of fiction and nonfiction picture books for grades K through 3 that depict characters of color, Professor Aronson contributes to the national dialogue about diverse children's books by encouraging publishers, book reviewers, and consumers to think not just about whether books are diverse, but what the messages might be conveyed by different themes and the importance of a range of representation of children of color and the impact on inclusion and bias. Ultimately, her work explores how teachers and parents can use multicultural books in everyday life to help their kids and students appreciate the diversity of us all. Dr. Aronson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Julie. I'm really happy to be here.
And so, Howard, I'd love for you to start us off. You have worked with children and adults and have done extensive work in helping people recognize bias and appreciate other cultures. Can you tell us why it is so important for children to learn about diversity and inclusion?
Sure, Julianne. And let me just say to begin that I'm really happy to be doing this because I think the work you're doing at First Book is just so important and so valuable. I do have a lot of experience on both sides because I spent the first 13 years of my career as a teacher and a school administrator with 2 through 12-year-old children. And then since that time, I've been working with adults for, as you said, over 30 years. So this has been my life. And I think it's so important for us to recognize, first of all, that we're raising children for a different world than most of us grew up in. The world is increasingly becoming diverse. Diversity is not tangential anymore to people's life. It's not like it was 30 years ago when we started doing diversity work. It was sort of this thing we did on the side. But now it's very clear that understanding diversity is essential to getting along in this community that we're now all a part of. And that starts with children. And my experience has been that in working with children around these issues and learning from children, frankly, about these issues, that early learning exposure is so important because it's in these formative stages, particularly when you get past 3 years old and up, that children they're starting to look at themselves differently, first of all. Their metacognitive ability is starting to develop so they can observe themselves. They're starting to observe themselves in the context of other people around them. We leave that early stage of development where we're sort of merged with our parents. And everybody on the call who's had a child and seen them go through terrible twos know what that separation is like. And then at some point we begin to discover, well, we're ourselves apart from our parents, but now we also have to have these relationships with other people around us. And there's no question, we know from the research that as early as 3 months old, for example, children start to demonstrate an observation of race in different ways. They start to relate to people of different races in different ways. And certainly that just continues to grow as we get older. So the early learning, the early exposure is so important. And a big part of that too is the development of empathy. As children begin to develop themselves, their identity as distinct from people around them, they're then confronted with this question about, how do I relate to this person versus myself versus my family member? And the development of empathy, a lot of the development of empathy in our research comes from an understanding of other people's stories, the narrative of other people's lives, and understanding how the narrative of other lives juxtaposes against our life. And even for a small child, I remember, when I was teaching, I was able to break down some pretty complex concepts to them in ways that they can understand. A lot of it is translation. So the research that we're finding now around the development of things like self-observational capability and empathy, understanding which is essential to understanding our own biases and learning to work with our own biases, is teaching us that the earlier we can get people to begin to see themselves as part of a larger world in which people operate differently is essential to that. Some of the folks who are with us might be familiar, for example, with the concept of what's called TCKs, or third culture kids. The kids who grow up in other cultures begin to demonstrate more plasticity in the brain in terms of understanding languages, the concept of culture. You begin to see the world as different rather than right or wrong. And this is, of course, essential for the development of empathy, and it's also essential for the development of an inclusive culture in which people can develop a sense of belonging. The research that I've been doing lately is on belonging, and this is another place where we see it's really important for young children, that we all as human beings have a profound and maybe even a primary need to fit in, to belong with the groups that we're a part of. And as we have increasingly diverse communities in schools, as children are being exposed to more and more diversity in their schools, understanding those differences is a big piece of building that belonging culture. Now, one of the things that always surprised me when I was working with kids is how we can begin to take concepts that we think are much too complex for them and turn them into learning experiences. So, for example, when I'm working with, just yesterday I was at Auburn University working with faculty, staff, and students down there talking about unconscious bias. And I talked to them about the brain science behind it and some of the neurocognitive science and the social science and all of this stuff. And, you hear those concepts and say, how could you possibly do preschoolers? But at the same time, I work with my grandchildren, as young as 4 and 5 years old, and start to teach them about slow brain versus fast brain thinking. And, which part of the brain do you think you thought that thought came from, and was that, did you really think carefully about that, or was a reaction thought? And so we can do that, and I think the kinds of books that you're creating, I see Ghosts for Breakfast over your left shoulder, and I know we're going to talk about some of the other ones, are books that actually put children in another person's world. In a way that gives them a real sense of, gee, what must it be like for that kind of a person? What must it be like if I lived that life? It helps children make the link between commonalities between my world and the different worlds that they're being exposed to. All of that is part of the process. Now, obviously, no book stands on its own, and that a teacher or a parent does with the child in discussion about the book is as important or more important than the book itself. But having a book that in a way that entertains kids, that draws their interest and brings it up to the surface is really important. I think the last thing I would say is that whether we're in schools or later as they get later in life, the ability to communicate across those differences is so important. We see how much we suffer right now in society from the fact that we don't know how to communicate about these issues. We don't know how to talk about difference, whether it's gender or race or sexual orientation. We talk incessantly with each other about it, but have a very difficult time bridging the gap. And of course, we know that that's true about our political lives as well. I think one of the things that we can do when we create a sense of ease with children about talking about these issues is to begin to train them for a life in which they can broach these issues with other people. They can come up to somebody and say, gee, I'd love to talk with you about the gender dynamics here. I'd love to talk with you about what's going on in our racial or cultural community here. And I think all of those things are critically important to kids at a young age. So if I had a message for anybody, a parent or a teacher based on my experience, it would be, as we get into this conversation, is that don't listen for the limitations of what you think children can absorb. My experience is that they will always surprise you by how much more they can absorb than you thought they could if it's languaged in a way that they can understand.
Thank you so much, Howard. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Hanna, I want to turn now to you, because Lee and Low is such a powerhouse when it comes to getting diverse books into the public and in lifting up the voices of authors of color. And so I'd love for you to tell us more about how you encourage educators to use diverse books when teaching about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to start by giving a little bit of a background on Lee and Low Books as a company for those of you who aren't familiar with us yet. We're the largest multicultural children's book publisher in America. Our mission is to publish books that are about everyone, for everyone, and we take that mission very seriously. Lee and Low publishes books for a wide range of young readers, including picture books, middle grade, and young adult titles. And we're really honored to be working with First Book on their Stories for All project, which will help make some of our favorite titles available and accessible through the First Book Marketplace. It's really wonderful for me to be a part of this webinar so early on in the new school year, because this is a really great time to start anew and to reflect on how diverse books are being used in our classrooms. So as you're planning out your year and looking at your library, consider where and when diverse books are being integrated into your teaching. One really powerful activity that you can use to start thinking about this in a deeper way is doing an evaluation of your classroom library. There are a lot of tools out there that can help you with this, but one I just want to share is a really popular one that we created called our Classroom Library Questionnaire. And I think there's a slide so you all can see a little bit of what that looks like. So this is a simple PDF. You can download it from our website. We'll be sending a link to it in the follow-up to this webinar. And this will help you think a little bit more critically about the books that are already in your collection. It covers many different facets of diversity. So that includes race, gender, LGBTQ diversity, geographic diversity, language diversity, and diversity of topics. And it also asks you to consider if all of the diverse books in your library are about topics like race and prejudice, or if they cover a wider variety of genres. So often, diverse books are relegated to heavy themes, serious nonfiction, or very culturally specific stories. But on the contrary, books about white characters cover a wide range of topics, themes, tones. This is something that it's really important for us as educators to be aware of, so that you don't accidentally reinforce the idea that students of color can only star in one type of story, a sad one. Great, thanks for showing that slide. So Even if you feel that your library classroom is diverse, I would really recommend using our classroom library questionnaire as a way to guide you and maybe help illuminate some holes in your collection. Armed with that knowledge, you can really start to build out your library in a more intentional way with books that address the gaps that you've identified. So the classroom library evaluation is something that you can do on your own after school hours, but some teachers find that it's even more powerful to do together with students. In this way, students can really think critically about how books represent or misrepresent the world that they themselves are living in. Last year on our blog, we featured a 5th grade teacher named Jessica Lifshitz from Northbrook, Illinois, and she had done an evaluation like this in her classroom together with her students. Again, I will share the link in the follow-up email so you can see details about what she did, but I wanted to walk you through a little bit of her process. So Jessica began by sharing background information on the lack of diversity in children's literature in the form of our infographic. And I believe there's a slide of this infographic so you all can see it too. This is the infographic. This is an infographic which Leanne Lowe created based on statistics. Here it is. Based on statistics from the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And it shows the percentage of children's books published that are by or about people of color over time. It shows the number of diverse books has remained persistently low for more than 2 decades. And for those of you who are teachers who have been searching for diverse books, this is not going to be any surprise to you. All right, you can cut back. So after delving deep into this infographic and talking about the lack of representation in children's books, Jessica and her students did an audit of their classroom library together to find out how different genders and races were represented. Each student randomly grabbed about 25 books and evaluated them using a simple data collection sheet. And they answered questions like, are there people of color on the cover? If there's a character on the cover, is it a boy? Once the students finished collecting all this data, they went together to look at the results and they shared their observations. And students came up with some really amazing observations. Like they noticed that even though in real life the sports world is incredibly diverse, most of the sports fiction they had in their classroom featured white characters. They also noticed that there were several books featuring African American characters, but they didn't see as many other races represented. This was a really powerful lesson, and it's one that you can do right now, regardless of the age of your student or the makeup of your classroom. And when you do it early in the year, it can encourage students to think really critically about representation in books and also give them a personal stake in what you choose to read as a class throughout the year. Once you've done this evaluation of your school library, the next question to ask yourself is, are you making use of that whole library? If you have a great diverse library, are your diverse books being used all the time, or are they being separated or set apart in some way? One problem that we see all the time is that diverse books are often relegated to specific times of year, so holidays, heritage months, things like that. Diverse books teach core values, they teach social and emotional learning, they teach many other key concepts. So, for example, it's fine to read bilingual books right now while we're in Hispanic Heritage Month, but books featuring Latinx main characters can and should be used throughout the year for a variety of lessons. One way you can do this early in the year is by using diverse books to help build classroom community. You can do this by choosing read-alouds that honor students' experiences. Diverse books with elements that may feel familiar, such as books that revolve around food or around family, can help students make connections between different cultures and experiences. And you can follow up those read-alouds with questions like, who is in your family? What's it like where you live? What's your favorite food at home? Leanne Lowe offers a free downloadable Building Classroom Community curriculum unit designed for grades K through 2, and it's got lesson plans and suggested read-alouds. And again, we'll send a link to that in the follow-up, but there are a lot of resources that can help you find books that really support classroom community early on in the year. Diverse books can also support social and emotional learning throughout the year. So I wanted to end by just sharing a couple of our titles, all of which are available right now in the First Book Marketplace, and how they can support SEL. So I wanted to start with this one, Bird, by Zetta Elliott and illustrated by Shadra Strickland. I love this book, and this is a really sophisticated picture book for grades 6 through 8. It's about a young boy who's dealing with grief after the death of his older brother. So this picture book is a really strong mentor text for practicing inferencing with students through a social emotional learning lens. As a reader, you have to infer or figure out from the author's clues about how Bird is feeling. You can ask students to think about how Bird's feelings evolve over the course of the book, and you can also give clues from the text and illustrations to help them justify their reasoning. A more fun and light, happy book that I also love is Hot Hot Roti for Dada G. This book is another great example of exploring social and emotional learning with students. This is a really joyful picture book for grades K through 5. In it, Anil's grandparents come to visit from India. So you can use this with students to chart Anil's changing emotions and feelings on a timeline, and also encourage students to identify his feelings from both the text and the illustrations. Hot Hot Roti can also be used with text-to-self connections. For example, Anil loved when his grandfather tells him stories. How do you feel when a family member or friend tells you a story? You can have students write down a few feelings.
And Hannah, can you show, when you show the books, can you show them a little higher so we can see?
Oh yes, sorry about that.
Okay.
Hot Hot Roti. Okay, Hot Hot Roti for Dada G is one of my favorites. And then the last one that I will show is Seaside Dream. All right, now I've got it. Seaside Dream is a picture book for grades 1 through 5. It's about a girl whose grandmother came to the United States from Cape Verde and sometimes misses her faraway home. So this is a great book for teaching about immigration, but it's also a story that you can use as a jumping off point for students to think about the ways that they can be kind to their classmates and show empathy and compassion like the main character, Cora. And empathy and compassion are core values. They're things that are emphasized in a lot of schools throughout the year. And so really consider which diverse books you might include in teaching about these values. First Book, I should mention, has created really wonderful one-page tip sheets for these books and for many others to help you make the most of them throughout the year. So you can find additional lesson plans for them also on our website, leonlow.com. So there's a lot of resources out there to help you using these books in your classrooms. There's a ton of great ways to use diverse books to foster a culture of inclusion, but hopefully this gives you a few places to start.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thanks for showing some of those books. For those of you that are joining us, and you will get an email following this webinar with all the resources, but those books and many others that Hannah showed are featured on the First Book Marketplace with resources already outlined and ready for you. So you have some guides there to help you use them with your students immediately. So I'd love to look now to Dr. Krista Aronson. You have done in-depth research into the representations presented in diverse children's books. And I'd love for you to talk to us a bit about the messages conveyed in multicultural books and how we should be thinking about them.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you. As my colleagues have said, diverse books are very important. By diversifying your bookshelves, you provide opportunities for children, all children, to see themselves reflected and celebrated in their classrooms. And this is important for a number of reasons. Research shows that diverse books can impact literacy positively. It also can have lasting effects on children's development of positive self-concept and identity, and can influence their ability to form meaningful relationships across all sorts of difference. So who is on your bookshelf matters. And just to echo and talk a little bit more about some of the things that Hannah mentioned, how is also important. How are the groups on your bookshelves represented? Messages matter, and it's those messages that I deeply consider within my own work. My colleagues and I have identified 9 categories that dominate picture books featuring diverse characters. We've focused in the development of these categories on multicultural books, so books featuring human characters from underrepresented racial and cultural groups. And I'd like to use 2 of these categories to illustrate my point and to inform your thinking as you are taking a look at and evaluating your own classroom libraries. So first, one of the categories is oppression. And oppression stories are those that feature mistreatment or discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and culture. So stories about slavery, stories about the civil rights movement, stories about internment. Oppression stories can be very powerful for children of color. They can provide mirrors. They can render children's stories as visible and valuable, which can affect the development of positive self-concept and can also have a direct effect on literacy. There is evidence that stories, oppression stories, are particularly effective for African-American children, feeling as though their stories and in history and their experiences are real and valued, and providing connection and engagement and interest in reading, and thus developing literacy. Oppression books can also provide windows into an experience that may differ from one's own experience, which is also important. Our research indicates that the majority of books, oppression stories, feature African-American characters, are set in times of slavery or during the civil rights movement, which means that when a child picks up a book featuring an African-American character, they're most likely going to be exposed to a story of struggle and triumph. These stories are important. We need to transmit these stories to our children. But an exclusive emphasis of these stories on one's bookshelf can underrepresent the full humanity of African-American characters, African-American experiences, and at the same time, communicate a stereotype about the African-American group.
Dr. Anderson, can you speak up just a little louder?
Yes, I'm sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. And so these stories are important, but they, an overpopulation of them on the shelves can be problematic. We find less representations, I'll share this book, for instance, of the types of oppression that other groups might be facing or have faced within the United States. This is one that we point to. It's an oppression book, Si Se Puede, but it is about the janitor strike in Los Angeles in 2000. And so it focuses on Latinx communities within this, within LA, really featuring and talking about the need for, the process of, and the outcome of strikes. And so this could be a valuable addition to your bookshelf if you take a look and you see that most of the stories about struggle and triumph are featuring African-American characters. So another one of our categories is cross group, and this is one that's near and dear to my heart and one on which I've done my own research within the communities that I live. Cross-group books are books about interaction across difference. It can be racial or cultural difference. It can be differently abled children. It talks about friendships, whether or not those are friendships between peers or between an adult and a child across some sort of difference. Cross-group books can be very powerful in helping to shape attitudes and increase willingness to interact across difference. So we find that in as few as 6 reading sessions, so children being read books depicting interaction across difference 6 times, can have a meaningful and lasting effect on children's attitudes and on their intended behaviors. Most of the cross-group books that are published within the United States feature interactions between characters who are Black and white. And although this is important, it does not provide opportunities for children to experience and observe interactions across other types of racial or cultural difference. So one book that we love that breaks this mold is Juna's Jar. And within this book, there are 2 friends who are the primary focus. There's Juna, who is an Asian American girl, and then her friend, who is a Latinx American boy. And unfortunately, he does move away, but there is a happy ending in the book that involves yet another cross-group relationship. What makes this book solid for affecting attitude change is that the children are depicted interacting directly with one another. They are seen playing directly together. So in that way, the friendship is central to the storyline, and it is direct. It's also positive. Research shows that cross-group books are most effective when they do not involve conflict or strife, even if that is resolved, but instead shows children doing things that the reader would consider normal for children to be doing, playing and having fun together exclusively. So I invite you to think about who is on your shelves, but also what are they doing or how are they represented using these two examples. As you do your classroom evaluations, consider, do I have an overrepresentation of a particular group within a particular category, or am I capturing the full range of experiences both within and across the groups that are on my shelf? If you are interested in learning more about the research that I've described, or you want to access a free online tool that you can use to search and identify books, picture books, featuring human characters of color, you can search by category, as I've described, the 2, and there's descriptions of the remaining 9. You can also search by racial, ethnic, or cultural group. Or by everyday activities such as language, food, holidays. You can access the Diverse Book Finder, and you can maybe show that slide with the web address, the diversebookfinder.org. This online tool is linked with a physical collection that's housed here at Bates College. And all the books that you see online, there are a couple thousand of them, all published since 2002. You can check them out through interlibrary loan if you would like to preview them before making a purchase.
All right, thank you so much for that information, the Diverse Book Finder. It will certainly help a lot of folks. I know we've got questions from across the nation, and many folks were asking where to find diverse books, and so thank you for sharing that. Want to turn now and open the floor for questions. As I mentioned earlier, many of you had a chance to submit questions during registration, and so we'll begin with those. However, we've been receiving questions during the talk and ask that if something has come to mind, please go ahead and let us know, and we'll do our absolute best to get to it. I want to start off with a question, and I'm going to direct this to you, Howard, from someone in Idaho. And they say that in their school district, they face the issue of having a majority of the same ethnicity with a slow rising population of different ones, and having students to accept and take interest in and embrace one another. And so their question is, how do they teach students to welcome and accept each other in their schools specifically? And if you could talk about from elementary level all the way to high school.
Sure. I think it's, it's one of the things to keep in mind is that what research on bias shows is that bias against groups is strongest when those groups aren't present. So for example, the strongest racial bias that gets measured in our country is generally measured in communities that are almost all white. It seems sort of, it seems sort of odd that it would be that way, but if you think about it, it makes sense, because one of the reasons it happens is when you're not exposed to real people of a particular group, you rely on stereotypes, and those stereotypes are generally not positive. And so in an environment like that, the use of books for children can be especially valuable, because what we could do is to balance some of those negative stereotypes with some positive messaging. And so exposing kids from those ages, supplementing it with movies, other kinds of stories, bringing in people who may not be their peers, but who are adults from those groups, all of those things can really help. And in that context, also to start having helping children understand some of the nuances of culture, so that we know, gee, being from a different culture means you might have different values. What does that mean? You might like different things. Different things might be important to you. You might have different ways of communicating. You might have different ways of showing love and respect. You might have different expectations about who's going to speak and when, and whose voice is important, all of these kinds of things. So I think in homogeneous communities, and this is true, by the way, whether they're homogeneous majority communities or communities of people of color, the more we can expose people to some of those other models, some positive role models, children and people, for that matter, from those other groups, the better likely they are to develop some alternative to hardcore wired biases.
Thank you. Our next question, I'd love to direct to Dr. Aronson. Can you share some examples of go-to questions that readers can ask children to consider text from a literacy lens? Can you talk about go-to questions that educators can ask their students to help them cultivate an awareness and appreciation and understanding?
Great question. If I can just briefly touch on the previous question as well, I will again mention cross-group books. They are most effective in homogeneous environments, to answer the question from Idaho, I believe it was. That cross-group books are very effective with changing attitudes and shaping ideas. So identifying, using the diverse book finder to identify cross-group books featuring the types of diversity that you're interested in might have a great effect. In terms of how to ask questions and engage discussions, am I understanding your question, Julie?
Yeah. Yes.
The types of questions I think are very specific to the outcome goal, right? Unfortunately, my direct research does not touch on literacy development, and so that's a topic that I feel less informed to speak about. But in terms of attitude shaping and change, there's a lot of evidence that guiding children to think about the commonalities that the characters in the book share, kind of setting up a superordinate identity, let's say. Maybe all of the children are interested in sports, or the two children interacting are interested in bugs. Drawing attention to those commonalities, the things that unify them, can be very important. That does not have to be done in the absence of talking about the ways in which they differ culturally. That can also be done to set up the idea that they are both the same and different, and teaching children that that's okay. Those two types of conversations can be very important. I would go with the type of conversation that an individual teacher is the most comfortable with, that resonates most with their own identity. If that is looking for commonalities, research shows that that will be effective. If that's developing two attitudes or ideas that they can be the same and different, then that is also an effective message to send through dialogue.
Thank you. Another question we have, and I would like to direct this to Hanna and possibly to you too, Howard. How do I help teachers that I work with realize the benefits of representing various families in their books and story times, even if it does not adhere to their personal or religious beliefs?
That's a really, really good question. We run up against that a lot when we're talking about the need for diverse books in all different sorts of communities. And one thing that I point people to often is Dr. Dean Sims Bishop's idea of books being both windows and mirrors. Some of you might be familiar with this phrase, but Dr. Bishop essentially argued that children need books that function as windows. So windows into somebody else's culture or some other type of experience, as well as mirror books in which they can see themselves, and that all children should be able to access both types of books. And regardless of exactly what kinds of differences you're talking about, what background students might bring, I think from a literacy perspective, there's a lot of positive things about offering both types of books. I think that one thing that is also a nice way in is just empathy, and arguing for kids to have access to different types of experience to build empathy. And that's something that you can often kind of offer as a first step for people who are resistant to bringing more cultural books to their classrooms. And I also think that there is a sort of economic argument to be made for exposing students to different cultures through different types of diverse literature. We live in a global economy, a global world, and giving students the tools to bridge the gaps between different cultures early on benefits them in the long run, professionally, economically, as well as in terms of personal development. So even for teachers who are resistant or who feel like, well, we don't have certain groups in our school. We don't necessarily need to represent them. I think that there are a lot of good benefits that all students receive from having access to both window and mirror books, no matter where they are.
Thank you.
Yeah, Julie, one of the things I think that's important to say about this is, we can't pretend like this isn't really a difficult issue. I think it shows up sometimes certainly around race, but it especially shows up around sexual orientation, of course, in our culture. And most schools have very strong policies around race, but with sexual orientation is all over the board in terms of what people are doing around the country around that. And this is really challenging. And so I certainly don't want to minimize the challenge in doing it. I think one of the things that's really important is structural, and that is particularly for schools. I mean, clearly families are going to make their own choices, but for schools, just as a former school administrator, I know one of the things that was always important to me is that everybody who's a teacher in the school understand what our school's philosophy is and what we're trying to accomplish as a school relative to these issues. And understand, very much like we do now in corporations, that the people have to understand that regardless of what your personal philosophy is, our business has a philosophy of, let's say, equal treatment for people of sexual orientation or various different areas. And the unfortunate politicization of diversity has added to this rift sometimes, because it gets tossed into the political kind of nonsense that we're in today. And if you do this, that means you're on that side of the fence versus the other side of the fence. So one important aspect is that all of the teachers in the school understand that this is our school's philosophy. You're entitled to have your personal philosophy at home, but you're in the school, this is what the school's philosophy is. And then the second part of it is to also offer alternatives. If there are people who find something so difficult to do because they consider it morally objectionable, and you don't feel like you have the ability to help them get past that, then often you're better off having somebody else introduce that material than to have that particular teacher introduce the material. And that can be done in a way that's virtually invisible to the children. But I think that you're better off having somebody who legitimately sees the importance of children learning this than somebody who feels like they're going through the motions, because going through the motions actually communicates a lack of enthusiasm for the material. And my experience is that kids are incredibly sensitive to those kinds of energetic phenomena.
Thank you. Our next question, and we got a lot of questions related to either students interacting with families and parents, or interacting with staff. And so this question relates to parents, and maybe a little similar to the one we just had. But someone says, I work in a diverse school where students pretty much stick to themselves. In a recent assignment to study a different country, a parent refused to have their child study a country that was not their origin. How do I help parents who are resistant to exploring cultures outside of their own become more open to learning about them?
I'll jump in for a moment on that. I think, this speaks to the nature of, what's the best way to do education for young children in general. And I don't think there's any question that any way we can get parents involved in understanding what their children are learning is critically important. If you've got children learning something, especially when it's something that's outside of the realm of what the parents consider to be their value system, that obviously creates real challenges, because the child comes back with enthusiasm talking about what they've seen, and then encounters a buzzsaw when their parent is upset by it or thinks it's wrong or something like that. And so we used to have workshops for parents on a regular basis when we were introducing new material. For example, I remember we did one big curriculum piece on disability, and we were bringing in, we had one of the parents in the school who was quadriplegic, and we did exercises with the children. We read books, of course, but also did exercises with the children simulating blindness and things like this. But before we did it, we brought all the parents together, and we shared with them what we were doing, give them a chance to talk through some of the issues so that they could support the children in their learning. And I think that's critically important, especially when you're dealing with controversial issues.
Thank you. And a question from online, how can we start encouraging that diversity for children from ages 6? How can we start encouraging diversity for children from ages 0 to 6? They want to know what books would be good to promote cultural inclusiveness, especially for those in rural communities. And I know we spoke earlier about, making sure that the people that you see, like your environment has an influence on your understanding of different cultures. But can we speak to what books would be good to promote cultural inclusiveness in rural communities in particular?
So I can talk a little bit about a couple of our books that I think would be good. Again, going back to what Dr. Aronson talked about before, I think that books that promote intercultural connection and play are really, really great for this. We have a couple of books that make really excellent read-alouds, especially for young readers. One that I would recommend that's old but really popular still is called Being With You This Way. It's by W. Nicola Lisa. It's been used in many classrooms for many years, but it's just about different kids from a neighborhood playing together. The background is urban, but it doesn't need to be urban. I mean, it doesn't need to be used in an urban environment. And then I think when you have a different background, like a different setting, that's another way you can talk about difference, not just cultural difference, but also geographic difference. We also have a new series called Confetti Kids, which is part of our Dive Into Reading series. These are really early chapter books, and they just feature different characters playing together in a city, but they promote friendship. They talk about food and family and different things. They're in very short chapters. They make really good read-alouds, and there's a lot of little things that can be talked about afterwards. So the Dive Into Reading series is another one that I would recommend. But I would say looking for books like the ones Dr. Aronson talked about that feature different groups playing together are a great way to kind of gently bring very young students into that discussion and get them thinking about what makes us different, what makes us similar, how can we facilitate this conversation?
I think that's a great suggestion. I understand that you're having a little bit of trouble hearing me. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great.
A little bit louder.
Okay. So I just I was kind of thinking about the rural question, and I agree with everything that Hanna said. I think trying to find books, they might not be set in the rural United States. They might be set in another country that in a rural place, that can help children kind of see the ways in which their rural experience or their lives may be similar and different from those in another rural setting. I just went into the diverse book finder to help trigger my thinking about this, and I typed rural into the search box, and I did find some suggestions. I see Queen of the Track, written by Heather Lang, tells the story of Alice Coachman, who made history as the first African-American woman to win the Olympic gold medal. And I do see the pictures in the story really depicting her experience in a rural environment. So maybe finding ways to make connection in that way. I also see a number of rural stories set in Africa, as well as in Tibet. And so that might be another, and just a different way to help children think about rural and to think about diversity.
Thank you. We have another question from the registration forms. What are some effective ways to have the conversation of diversity with students who may not look like you? Howard, if you want to give that a go, or perhaps Dr. Aronson as well.
Sure. So just to be clear, what the question is, this is a student-to-student conversation, or this is a teacher-to-student conversation, or parent-to-student conversation?
A teacher to student.
Teacher student. That's what I thought, but I just wanted to be sure. You know, I think that we have a remarkable opportunity as adults to create a sense of comfort in dealing with these issues with children. And I think what we do. There's a wonderful quote from, I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "Who you are speaks so loudly I can't hear a word you're saying." I think our way of being is the most important place to start. And in order for people to feel comfortable talking to children about these differences, they have to feel comfortable in themselves. You can't take the children any farther than you've gone yourself. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is to help teachers, and this is a responsibility not just of the individual teacher, but of course of the school itself, to help teachers develop a facility with the topic, to help them feel comfortable enough talking about the topic so that it doesn't come across as awkward or stiff or forced when they're talking to the children. Then once they've done that, once they're more comfortable themselves, then those conversations can flow much more fluidly with the child to bring curiosity to the question. What do you notice about us? Do you notice anything different about me from you? What do you think that means? Do you have any experience with that? To really start by inquiring into the child's world and the child's worldview about what you're saying. I think what can happen sometimes with children, especially around issues of race, I think more than almost any other issues, it can be other issues of diversity as well, but especially with race, is that because even when we support the notion of diversity, we can bring a sort of righteousness to the conversation, like we're teaching the children the way to be as opposed to getting them into an inquiry, and they pick up on that energy, and that can sometimes stifle their sense of inquiry because they switch into needing to please the teacher mode or needing to keep the teacher happy, which can sometimes mean adapting behavior that they may not genuinely feel yet, and it can also mean sometimes suppressing how they're feeling for fear of upsetting the teacher. So I think it's really important that we focus on self-understanding as a teacher and also using inquiry as a method. And I'd love to hear what Dr. Aronson has to add to that.
I'd love to. The wheels are turning as you're
speaking.
I'm
sure. I could see in your face.
I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. A big part of it has to do with self-exploration and being comfortable with one's own identity. And I see that in my own classroom. I teach the majority of students who are different from myself in terms of their racial, cultural, or ethnic background. So I can really sympathize with this question, both from a professional and personal standpoint. I think that one of the things that we have to embrace when we talk about these things is it's going to take directions we do not anticipate. And we just kind of have to lean into that. It's going to happen. There are going to be awkward moments. Students are going to say things or do things that make us uncomfortable as teachers and make other students uncomfortable in the classroom. And that's part of them. It's actually not a bad thing. It's part of them voicing thoughts and feelings that they may have had but not felt comfortable sharing before they knew that they were allowed to. And it provides an opportunity for us to counterbalance the types of messages or ideas that they may be expressing with our own. It gets them out into the open, not necessarily so that we have to correct them or fix them, but so that they can be discussed and examined rather than go unexamined within the classroom and for that child. So it is very hard. Being comfortable with your own identity is important. Knowing that everyone's going to stick their feet in their mouths. And I tell my students that we're all going to say things that we wish that we could take back, that we will later revise, and that we have to allow each other the space and the give each other the forgiveness that is involved in those types of conversations and in that kind of work.
Yeah. Julie, can I add just two more points real quickly to that struck me as I was listening to Krista talk. One is that I think one of the things that's really important, especially for those of us in the dominant group, racially, for example, often what I see in teachers and in parents is in trying to teach kids diversity, we tell them all about the other groups, but we don't own our own group as also a cultural group. And so for white teachers, for example, they'll often, and with all the best intentions, sometimes teach children about how African Americans are and Latinos are and Asians are, but they also don't talk about white culture. And this creates, it actually can reinforce the otherness sometimes. It reinforces the notion that, well, we're normal, we don't have to talk about us, we're just talking about the other. And so I think that that's one thing that's really important. The second is to encourage people not to overreact to the things that kids say, because kids say things sometimes in a completely different context than we see them as adults. And I can share a personal anecdote about this. My oldest sons are about 19, 20 months apart. And one day I was in the playground with them, took them to the playground. They were 5 and 4 years old or so at the time. And the older one called the younger one the N-word. Now, both of my boys are white. And I was shocked, of course. And I immediately pulled him over and I said, "What did you say?" And he said, What are you talking about?" And I said, "Do you know what that word means?" And he said, "It means you're dumb," or something like that. And I said, I explained to him what the word was, and he was appalled. His jaw dropped. I didn't mean, and it turned out that what they had been playing with 2 of their friends the day before, who were African American, who were also brothers, and one of the brothers had called the other brother that, and he just thought it was just a generic insult. Now, when I told him what it was, he was, "Oh, I didn't mean that. I was sorry," you know. But it was really my reaction that had to be controlled so that I could explain to him what he was saying, rather than, you know, coming in like the police and fixing him. And I think that's really important for us to understand, that they often don't know what they're saying means.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question. Can you go back to the we have a question about differently abled students in books that support. One is telling us, I struggle to find books that include differently abled children where the story does not revolve around the character's ability. Do you have any suggestions? And so, Dr. Aronson, want to toss this your way.
Okay. You know, that's a really good question. I think that I'm running through my mental log of all the books about disability, and you're right. Many of them do make that the feature. I mean, I think that's true with diverse books in general. They're very didactic, and they're very pointed in trying to communicate a specific moral lesson or value. I think I'm looking at the Diverse Book Finder. This is my lean on tool here to help me identify, and I've searched for disability books, and I encourage this person asking the registrant to do the same and evaluate which books might be best for their situation. But some titles that come up: My Pal Victor, 2 friends experiencing carefree camaraderie with one of the children having a disability. And it talks about having fun and friendship and how they can overpower physical limitations. Emmanuel's Dream, Max the Champion, is another book that comes up. I encourage to use the tool. There are books out there, and I think that would be really helpful in identifying the best one.
Hannah.
So, you may have noticed me walk away from the camera for a minute. I wanted to see if this one was on our wall and to pull it up if it was. So this is King for a Day by Roxana Khan. This is a wonderful book, and it features a main character who's in a wheelchair, but it's not about that at all. It actually takes place in Pakistan. It's about the holiday of Basant, which is a kite flying festival. And it's actually a book about bullying, where the main character is kind of protecting someone from a bully who's trying to cut down his kites. So this is a really wonderful one because it actually is not mentioned in the text at all that the main character is in a wheelchair. It's just part of the illustrations, and it's not a main part of the story. But again, you know, just kind of showing characters who are differently abled without having that be the focus of the story. And one other that I don't have on me, but that I do want to recommend is an early middle grade book called The Monster in the Mud Bulb. And this features a main character with dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is kind of similar to dyslexia. It's a learning disability, and the character, it's a mystery, and it's really funny, but the character deals with his dyspraxia, and it's not a huge part of the story. It's just kind of part of what makes him who he is, and it helps him in some ways when he's trying to solve the mystery as well. So that's another one that I would recommend.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to throw one into the mix as well. It's called No Fair to Tigers, and it was written by Eric Hoffman as part of an anti-bias curriculum. And it also, the nice thing about that one is it's also bilingual. It's written in both English and Spanish. So it tells a story of a young child in a wheelchair, and is written in both languages. So that's another one that people might want to check out.
Wonderful. Thank you all. We've got time for just one more question, and that's coming to us from online. What if teachers want to incorporate diverse texts, but their attempts aren't well received or supported by administration? What support, ideas, thoughts, encouragement do you have for someone in this situation? And it looks like you all probably have some thoughts. So start off with you, Dr. Aronson.
Okay, I think this is a great question, and it came up with in my mind in response to the question about the parent being resistant to writing or having their child about a culture that was not their own. I think that in that context, my mind immediately went to what's the broader community? What's the administrative support here? What's the community vibe from the school standpoint? Gosh, what do you do in an environment where there isn't that community support? Well, first of all, I'll offer encouragement. Don't stop doing what you're doing if that's the environment that you're facing, because there is a lot of evidence that it is important work. In my work, I really emphasize meeting the community where they are and thinking about, well, how could I frame this in a way where there would be a community buy-in? Sometimes research and evidence is that mechanism. Sometimes saying, I really think that this is important because research shows it can improve literacy. Sometimes it's like saying the data really show that by doing this, we're going to position our children well for a more diverse world, if that's an argument that's going to get traction. But sometimes evidence and data can be that persuasive component.
Thank you.
I would agree. I mean, I think that you know, one of the challenges we've had with diversity in general, and I say this as a mea culpa to my industry, having been a professional diversity consultant now for almost 35 years, is that sometimes those of us in the world of diversity say things because we hope that they're true rather than we can prove that they're true. And I think what Dr. Aronson's pointing to, which is to bring evidence-based research, to talk to people about why this is important, to give them research about population trends, to help them see it outside of the political context I talked about earlier, but more from the standpoint of preparing students for the world that they're going to be growing up in, and to do what you can. You do as much as you can with the situation you're in, but to keep pushing the envelope. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I would just say I definitely agree with the research, and I think that there's a growing body of research that supports the literacy and academic benefits of diverse books. And I think, having access to that research and being able to present it can make a really good case. But I also think it's important to remember that the kinds of books that we're talking about do a lot of great things in the classroom, and they don't necessarily need to be labeled diverse. You can argue for using one of the diverse books we've talked about in any number of kinds of curricula, any number of lessons, to be included in summer reading for a lot of reasons other than just the fact that they're diverse. So to really think of these books as great books, as rich, complex texts, as books that have a lot to offer students, apart from just being diverse, and to not separate them out and segregate them so that the conversation is only about that, because sometimes that can be a difficult battle, but there are ways to try and integrate these texts in for a lot of other reasons, and they do a lot of things great. So that can kind of be like a gentle place to start and support their use in the classroom until you get full buy-in from your administration.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think that's a beautiful way for us to wrap up our conversation today. It is hard to believe that the hour has gone by so quickly, and we've definitely heard some great insight, perspective, actionable steps, even strategies that you can use to help teach diversity and inclusion, and as well as to support students, to engage your parents as well as your colleagues and peers. And so I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you on the panel for your thoughts and sharing your ideas with us today. We also want to just say another thank you to the NEA Foundation for their support. This has been a tremendous experience, and I hope that our conversation today has been illuminating, that it's been helpful, that it's been really insightful as far as how you can take action to support your students. And so on behalf of First Book, I thank all of you for your participation. And lastly, as a thank you to all of you who are joining us live, the NEA Foundation is making a special gift available to you, to registered First Book members, to help you purchase more diverse and multicultural books for your students. And so throughout the talk today, we've referenced an email and follow-up that you will be receiving. Tomorrow, you will receive from us a comprehensive follow-up that includes some of the titles that we talked about today, how to get more information from our panelists, as well as a gift from the NEA Foundation to help you as you work to get more diverse books into your classrooms and with your students. And so thank you so much again for joining us today. We wish you a wonderful day, and please look for an email from us about today's webinar. Thanks, everyone.